Hi, I'm Sebete Bulletin. In the Bleach universe, few individuals know and comprehend the events which determine the actual state of the world. Among them, there are Aizen Sosuke and Urahara Kisuke, and even though both have opposite worldviews, they both were the only ones to bring a new mystery to resolve to the world. Of course, I'm talking about the creation of the Hogyoku, an artifact capable of strengthening the souls nearby it, as if it was a god capable of granting power around it. So, today, I'm gonna try to explain what the Hogyoku is, why it can grant power as if it were a god, and also its creation and use during the story. Before I begin, this Hogyoku guide will be divided in two parts, and of course, there will be spoilers about the final arc as well as the tFearYourOwnWorld novels in order to better explain the Hogyoku. With that said, let's dive into the video. Alright, let's start by knowing the meaning behind the name Hogyoku. The upcoming info comes from a Reddit post by a user known as Trevi. If you want to know all the meanings and references behind the name Hogyoku, you can go check out his Reddit post. I've linked it in the description. That's how the word Hogyoku is written, and its translation is crumbling orb or breakdown sphere. However, there's a hidden meaning behind the kanjis used to form the name Hogyoku. I quote a paragraph of The Funeral of Japanese Emperors by François Massey. The term used to designate the death of the emperor, and which may not be used for anybody besides the emperor, is borrowed from the Chinese vocabulary Hogyo, which, going out of the quote for a moment, means crumbling as of a mountain. I turn back to the quote. In the same vein, one does not speak of the body of the emperor, but of his precious body Gyokutai. As we can see, Hogyo and Gyokutai, crumbling and precious body, refer to an emperor's corpse, referring to it as the crumbled or collapsed precious body of the emperor. So, in Bleach's context, the name Hogyoku will be making reference to the Soul King and his empty and dismembered body, thus converting a name revealed in the Soul Society arc into a nice foreshadowing to the revelation of the Soul King and his condition in the final arc. It's impressive how much information and context we as readers can get thanks to Kubo's way of naming alone. That's why us, the vast majority of readers outside Japan, skip over all of this information and extra context left by Kubo over all the things' names. Turning back to the subject, as we can see, there's a clear relation between the Hogyoku and the Soul King. However, the relation isn't limited to the names. As we can see, there's also aesthetic resemblances, cause both are sealed inside a sealing crystal. So, in order to find out why there are those resemblances, we're gonna travel back to the past, at the birth of the Reiō or Soul King. The world, before it was separated into various dimensions or realms, everything was mixed together on the same plane, meaning the spiritual world as well as the physical one were part of one dimension. In the spiritual world, any spiritual existence or body is named soul, and those souls are made out of spiritual particles or reishi. And as Ginjo comments, even in the physical or human world, everything possesses soul, even though it's locked inside a body made out of physical particles or reishi. So, therefore, all the universe's bodies are souls, and at that time, already existed a reincarnation cycle to allow the infinite circulation of souls. However, the Hollows started to devour human souls. This provoked the circulation of souls, or in other words, the universe's movement, to start to stagnate, because eventually all souls would be eaten and transformed into a gigantic menace, thus leaving the universe completely stagnated and therefore coming to an end. However, in order to evade this, as if the world rejected out of fear its tragic fate, a being capable of decomposing hollow souls and powers that ruled the divine was born, thus evading the stagnation of the universe and its inevitable end. So, taking into account all is constituted by souls, the only way the universe could create a being capable of controlling all the universe matter at his whim, it should have been done by mixing the major number of souls available to form this individual, regardless of the type of soul, meaning the world probably used all the existing types of souls, human souls, hollow souls, and souls of the entities and materials of the pit, and in large amounts, to create this individual. It's quite important to know the Soul King was created based on the Sum of Souls, cause the Hogyoku could also have been created based on the Sum of Souls, just as Aizen's words imply, alongside the Hogyoku's proper aspect, which seems to have a large amount of souls constituting its interior. So here we have the first key resemblance between the Hogyoku and the Soul King, cause both were properly created the same way. If you want to know more about the pit, which later will be known as Hell, and how it's related to the universe's origin or primordial world, go watch my video about Hell. Hope you will find it interesting. Now, due to the Soul King being formed out of all the existing types of souls in the universe, he was blessed with 2 unique powers. However, I'm only going to focus on the one we need to understand to explain the Hogyoku. In the near future, I plan on explaining my own interpretation of the Bleach universe's origin to the present time, where I will talk about this remaining power. For the time being, let's continue. The main ability of the Reiō lets him control all souls, meaning he could extract souls out of physical things like the Fullbringers and even manipulate them with his own soul directly. And also, he could share his soul onto other souls, like his child Yūhabak does. This way, he could change the properties and shape of souls, or even give them power. Thanks to this ability, the Reiō is capable of shaping souls and restructuring the distribution of all existing souls in the universe to create the current universe's appearance. And also, if we remember, even Yūhabak used this power after absorbing the Reiō to restructure the Royal Palace and eventually fuse all realms into only one to return to the primordial world he yearned of. Now, we already know the Hogyoku's power is the ability to read any soul's heart to understand their desires, then giving them the necessary power to accomplish those desires. So, if we take into account both the Reiō and the Hogyoku are made out of the Sum of Souls, and the fact that the Hogyoku possesses fragments of the Reiō as we'll be seeing later, to me that's what grants the Hogyoku the ability of sharing its soul with other ones, like the Reiō does. This will explain why the Hogyoku can grant power as its whim onto the souls around it, because what's actually doing is sharing its soul to grant power to another soul, like Yūhabak did with his Shrift. However, this ability also has its limitations. The Hogyoku will only share the necessary power to fulfill a soul's desire if the latter has the potential to fulfill this desire. That means, as Aizen implies, all souls have a maximum potential they can achieve, and it's determined by the race or type of soul and the base potential of each soul in question. For example, Aizen is born with a superior base or latent potential than the rest of souls, but Aizen, as a Shinigami soul, once he becomes a master over all the Shinigami combat arts, Sanjutsu, Hakuda, Hoho and Kido, he won't be able to strengthen any further as a soul. Therefore, he won't be able to augment his Reiō spiritual power far beyond his imposed limits as a Shinigami soul. That's why the Shinigami rely on an Asauchi, a soul formed out of the sum of many Shinigami souls forged in the shape of a sword. Those are impregnated with the Shinigami's essence, thus granting them with their own Sanpakuto and its unique abilities, which let the Shinigami strengthen as a soul beyond their imposed limit by the complete domination of the combat arts, like Yamamoto's case. However, this power of the Asauchi, in the end, also should have a potential limit based on the amount of souls that constitute them. So we can conclude that in the end, there exists a power limit a Shinigami soul can achieve, and the same should apply to the different existing types of souls, based on their type of soul and each individual's base or latent potential. That's why Ichigo's friends gain power through the Hogyoku to fulfill their desires, but they receive abilities in relation to their own potential and their maximum potential as human souls. For example, Tatsuki, Keigo and Mizuiro achieve to see spirit entities thanks to the Hogyoku's power, due to their desires of understanding and trying to help Ichigo. However, they don't obtain any special ability far beyond that. But Chad and Orihime obtain similar abilities to the ones of a Fullbringer, due to their frustration over their lack of power to protect what they want to protect. To know why both are blessed with this power, we need to know why a Fullbringer is born in the first place. In the tFearYourOwnWorld novels, it's implied that in reality, all Fullbringers possess a small fragment of the Reiō, and this fragment is transferred from mother to son or daughter when a mother is hurt by a hollow during pregnancy. So, the fragment of the Reiō that the hollow carried is transferred to the mother through the remnants of the hollow power left within their bodies after receiving a hollow wound, and consequently the human soul of her son or daughter will naturally mix with that small fragment of the Reiō, thus provoking the Fullbringer phenomena. human souls who are capable of manipulating other souls' properties and even change the proper shape of an object assigned to them when they grant their soul's power to the object's soul. In Orihime and Chad's case, we don't know if their mothers were wounded by a hollow, but both Orihime and Chad were hurt by a hollow at the beginning portion of the story. Therefore, their souls are mixed with the remnants of power from those hollows, meaning regardless of the fact that the hollow passed a fragment of the Reiō to Chad and Orihime or not, their souls have the potential or the necessary ingredients to awaken a Fullbringer, cause the Hogyoku possesses fragments of the Reiō, and when it shares its power with Orihime and Chad, it gives them the necessary power to artificially awakening their own Fullbringer. Whether it's through the Hogyoku sharing the power of the Reiō's fragment residing inside it with them, or by artificially awakening the supposed fragments of the Reiō within Chad and Orihime that they obtained through a hollow attack, thus awakening a Fullbringer without the necessity of being born with the natural conditions to awaken this type of abilities. Also, to further emphasize the power relation between the Hogyoku and the Reiō, we have Gerard Valkyrie's case. If we pay attention, Gerard's ability The Miracle works exactly the same as Aizen's transformations once he is fused with the Hogyoku. Cause every time they receive damage, or their strength isn't enough to achieve their desires of annihilating their opponents, both the Hogyoku and the Heart of the Soul King, which both are fused with Aizen and Gerard respectively, grant them the necessary power to recover of their wounds or strengthen their souls to the point of being able to defeat their objectives. So, as we can see, when Hogyoku or a part of the Reiō fuse with a soul, both function the same way, thus confirming the relation and similarity of powers between the Hogyoku and the Reiō. Alright, now that we understand the Hogyoku's power and its relation to the Reiō, why would Urahara and Aizen want to create an artifact like that? In Urahara's case, we don't know much about him. However, as Urahara himself comments, he created the Hogyoku to destroy and quickly recompose the division or boundary between hollows and Shinigami, to strengthen a Shinigami soul through holification. However, we don't know why Urahara decided to do those researches to strengthen a Shinigami soul, but in the last chapter of the tFearYourOwnWorld novels, Urahara's motives to create the Hogyoku are left implied. Shuhei Hisagi, after knowing the Soul King's identity and the original sin committed by the 5 noble families by dismembering and condemning the Reiō to be a puppet king without will, he goes to the world of the living to interview Urahara in order to write an article about him on the Serete Bulletin, the informative magazine from Serete. During the interview, Shuhei interprets that Urahara created the Hogyoku to create a soul as powerful as the Reiō, to then use that soul to grant an equivalent power to the one of the Reiō upon the rest of Shinigami, so he could utilize all their powers to gradually support the foundation of this world. A world which proposes an infinite reincarnation cycle of souls, and therefore the infinite prolongation of the universe's existence, and consequently also freeing the Reiō from his eternal sacrifice. This Shuhei's conclusion results to be pretty accurate, cause Urahara quickly notices that Shuhei probably thinks he created the Hogyoku by the Reiō's sake, and Yoriichi tells Urahara that Shuhei's thoughts weren't necessarily mistaken at all. However, Urahara denies it and tells us his motives to create the Hogyoku. Urahara's objective was to create something new, something that led to open a new door which showed him a never seen before knowledge, and the excuse to create something like that was to end the Reiō's eternal sacrifice through creating the Hogyoku, thus creating a soul capable of replacing him, or instead allowed to convert any Shinigami or any artificial soul made by him onto a soul with the same powers as the Reiō, to then use those souls to gradually help the foundation of this world. But Urahara shows regret by the fact of creating the Hogyoku, cause to him, that noble purpose was only an excuse to fulfill his curiosity as a scientist about finding out a new unknown knowledge, like Mayuri, who is capable of sacrificing anyone or anything in order to continue searching and unveiling a new never-seen knowledge. In Aizen's case, it's way easier to figure it out, cause his objective is to end the world's status quo, due to the fact that he doesn't tolerate the idea of being governed by an empty entity without will like the Soul King, while he serves as a puppet king who allows other inferior beings to him govern the world, like Central 46 or the 5 noble families. So, to replace the Soul King and defeat the Gotei 13 as well as anyone that stands against him, he only needs one thing, an artifact or method which allows him to break the power limits a Shinigami soul like him is condemned to. This way, he could strengthen himself as a soul to the point of being a transcendental being like the Soul King, thus owning the necessary power to shape the universe as his whim. as the Soul King did and does right now, serving as a linchpin to maintain the actual form of the universe. But Aizen, instead of being an empty existence, he would also govern as his whim the whole universe. Now, how did Urahara and Aizen conclude that creating a Hogyoku is the right thing to do in order to strengthen with success a Shinigami Soul? To know that, we first need to understand a fundamental concept about the distinct types of souls. In Bleach's world exist distinct types of souls, as I've commented earlier. However, every one of those types has its own antagonic or opposed part. A human supposed soul is a hollow, while a Shinigami supposed soul is a Quincy. This means, to strengthen a Shinigami soul far beyond its limited potential, the only way is trying to fuse a Shinigami soul with a hollow soul, cause the other compatible soul, the human one, lacks spiritual powers, even though there's always the exception to the rule. However, to fuse any compatible soul with another one, it's necessary to break the boundaries between both souls. This way, merging together those souls to make an individual's essence flourish to a superior dimension. However, this ain't a simple process as it sounds. A hollow soul's nature always tends to eat other souls. Therefore, this provokes the boundary between the two souls to collapse, allowing the two souls to merge together, and in turn, this provokes the soul's balance to crumble. And when this balance is destroyed, the process of what we know as holification starts, giving birth to a monster incapable of reasoning. However, that isn't the worst part. Depending on the amount of Reiōku's spiritual power, the holification will advance more or less, but independently of the Reiōku, their souls are destined to collapse. Meaning, as Urahara comments, when the hollow soul is already mixed with another one, not only the boundary between both souls becomes non-existent, the boundary between the soul itself and the external world souls also collapses, resulting in the soul auto-destroying himself, and even being unable to remain its form if the soul was pretty weak, thus losing its form completely due to the loss of the soul balance, as we can see with the residents of Rukongai, which were subjected to holification by Aizen. This phenomena is known as soul suicide, and is the main problem to achieve a successful and balanced fusion between a hollow soul and a Shinigami soul. So, Urahara and Aizen both arrive at the conclusion that they need a method or artifact capable of doing two things: introducing a part of this artifact or creative soul into a Shinigami soul, and by doing so, quickly break and recompose the boundary between two distinct types of souls, this way balancing out the soul to evade soul suicide. So, the first step is to create a being capable of penetrating into a Shinigami soul. The only beings capable of penetrating into a Shinigami soul without provoking the soul's imbalance are the Asauchi. Those are used to penetrate a Shinigami soul to then take the form of a Zanpakuto based on the Shinigami nature in question. Asauchi, as Nimaya comments, are created from the sum of a large number of Shinigami souls. So Urahara and Aizen probably tried to imitate the same process of creating a being out of the sum of souls to create their own Hogyokus, therefore granting it the ability of penetrating onto other souls, especially onto Shinigami ones like the Asauchi do. Aizen was the first one to create his Hogyoku, using as base a lot of souls of Rukongai and Shinigami souls as well, and eventually even a nail of the Soul King found on Rangiku, as explained in tFearYourOwnWorld. However, his Hogyoku didn't have the ability to evade soul suicide nor balance a soul permanently, meaning it couldn't recompose the boundary between souls to balance it out. On the other hand, Urahara's Hogyoku could do it, because even though Urahara's Hogyoku doesn't serve to revert holification, it actually fulfills Urahara's desire of saving the Visors, because it achieves to grant them the necessary power to supposedly recompose the boundary between the Hollow Soul and the Shinigami one. But why was Urahara's Hogyoku functional, even though Aizen's one was also created based on the sum of souls? To give an answer, let's first see how Urahara evaded the Visor's soul suicide. Urahara comments that during his exile on the world of the living, he has found a way to evade, in the 100% of the cases, the soul suicide. All that's necessary is to directly inject into a soul something antagonic to the hollowification. So let's further elaborate upon that. The boundary destruction between two types of souls, which provokes hollowification, happens when a soul loses its balance, as we have seen before. Therefore, when introducing into that soul an antagonic existence, this will push the soul balance to the other side. So, in the Visor's case, Urahara creates a vaccine formed out of Quincy arrows and human souls, which are the antagonic souls of the Shinigami souls and Hollow souls. This way, after injecting the vaccine, their soul's balance tips to the equivalent antagonic side, thus achieving to stabilize the Visors and evade soul suicide. However, as Urahara comments, evading soul suicide this way only serves to stabilize the soul at that moment. To 100% free a soul from ever disbalancing again, avoiding them from soul suicide isn't enough. For example, in the Visar's case, due to them being a mix of Hollow and Shinigami, the Hollow side will always try to break the boundaries between both types of souls to gobble or mix with the other one, because a Hollow's nature will always tend to eat other souls to satiate their lack of heart as a soul, thus provoking Hollowification once the antagonic properties of the vaccine disappear or dispel. So, to evade the Hollow side shaking the soul's balance, it required a constant antagonic power which can constantly contain Hollowification. In the Visar's case, Aizen implies this constant antagonic power is granted to the Visars by Urahara's Hogyoku, thanks to Urahara's desire of saving the Visars, which is fulfilled by his Hogyoku. That means Urahara's Hogyoku was created the same way Aizen's one did, by the Sum of Souls. But Urahara's one doesn't only contain Shinigami souls, regular souls of Rukongai, or a fragment of the Reiō. It also should probably contain the Visar's antagonic souls, like human souls and Quincy souls. Or maybe it contained more fragments of the Reiō than Aizen's Hogyoku did. And due to the Reiō being a mix of all existent types of souls, he could also serve as an antagonistic power to the Visar's one, because those fragments of the Reiō were also formed out of human souls and pit souls, which probably are the responsible for the Quincy's soul's birth, thus explaining why Urahara's Hogyoku could save the Visars, while Aizen's one couldn't fulfill Aizen's desire of successfully performing Hollowification, because his Hogyoku didn't have the necessary antagonistic power or properties to do so. However, Urahara won't discover the Hogyoku's true power of materializing soul's desires until after the Visar's incident. And unfortunately for him, Aizen quickly acknowledges Urahara's Hogyoku was capable of fulfilling his objective of strengthening a Shinigami's soul, because Aizen, after becoming a captain, already knows the Visars are still alive. Therefore, he deduces Urahara's Hogyoku serves to successfully hollowify a Shinigami soul, because otherwise, the Visars would have ended up auto-destroying as a souls through soul suicide. At this point, Urahara and Aizen decide what they will do with their Hogyokus. Urahara, as I said earlier, eventually discovers the Hogyoku's true power, using as evidence the Visar's incident, because while he continued his researches about Hollowification in the world of the living, he deduces his Hogyoku serves to grant that constant antagonistic power which allows the Visars live with normality. So, at that moment, regretting creating the Hogyoku by scientific whim, he probably tried to destroy it without success. So he decides to put a crystal seal or protector barrier over his Hogyoku to then hide it inside the soul. Because due to his whim of uncovering a new known knowledge, the current world is in danger of being threatened again with coming to an end if Aizen takes over his Hogyoku. Because Aizen, in order to replace the Soul King, he will need to kill him, implying the world will lose its form during this process, and therefore the infinite reincarnation cycle of souls will be affected by it, leaving room to the universe, once again, be in danger of coming to an end. Urahara's chosen soul to hide the Hogyoku was Rukia, due to her as a soul, as shown in the manga chapter covers, being a mix of Shinigami and another type of existence we don't know for the time being. So we can assume Urahara hid his Hogyoku in Rukia because he thought her non-type of existence could destroy or hide his Hogyoku once and for all. Kubo said in Club Outside, this unknown part of Rukia will be shown in some format. So whether it's the anime, the current Hell arc or a movie, we have to be patient until Kubo decides to tell us why Rukia is a distinct soul among the rest. Going back to this subject, Urahara should have hidden his Hogyoku before the events of Everything But the Rain, where Masaki's soul is parasited by White, an Aizen creation. Cause if Urahara possessed his Hogyoku at that time, he would have used it to grant a constant antagonistic power to let Masaki live a normal life. However, Urahara is forced to convert Isshin into a being somewhere between a Shinigami and a human, thanks to his Gigai conceived out of a human soul, thus converting Isshin into an antagonistic being to Masaki, to then attach Masaki's hollow with Isshin's human Gigai with spiritual filaments, thus allowing the antagonistic power of Isshin to keep in check Masaki's Hollowification, therefore serving as a constant vaccine to evade Masaki's soul suicide until she dies. So, when did Urahara hide his Hogyoku inside Rukia? Well, in Bleach chapter 0, Kione mentions Rukia made her first mission to the world of the living with her after Rukia joined the 13th division, and Rukia joined Ukitake's division 49 years before Byakuya was defeated by Ichigo, meaning Urahara was already exiled and already passed around 50 years on the world of the living. And also, Rukia adds that she didn't remember doing that first mission. So, therefore, as you reach in place in TFearYourOwnWorld, it's highly possible that Urahara took advantage of that first expedition to capture Rukia, hide his Hogyoku inside her, and subsequently erase her memory. Cause let's remember, Urahara couldn't step in Soul Society, so that's the only moment where he could have hidden his Hogyoku inside Rukia. Years later, Rukia is sent to the world of the living to come in contact with Ichigo, and Urahara decides to seal Rukia into a similar Gigai to the one he used with Isshin, meaning this Gigai was conceived out of a human soul and Kishi, or physical particles which constitute all the human world's bodies. Therefore, Soul Society couldn't detect it due to not being a Gigai made out of Reishi or spirit particles. But this one, in addition, also constantly divided the Reiō spiritual power of the Shinigami. So, instead of recovering a Shinigami's power like a normal Gigai made out of Reishi, it does the opposite. Meaning, Rukia never recovers his Shinigami powers, and little by little the connection with the Gigai weakens, until eventually the soul within that Gigai loses all of its Reiō spiritual power, therefore converting Rukia into an ordinary human, thus hiding Hogyoku from Soul Society and anyone who wants to find it. So, we can assume Urahara takes this extreme decision due to his regret of creating the Hogyoku, and that now this artifact can potentially provoke the world's end if it lands on the wrong hands, in this case on Aizen's ones. Therefore, it's possible the special part of Rukia wasn't capable of destroying or hiding Hogyoku, and he is forced to convert her into a human to evade Aizen getting his hands on it, thus evading Aizen accomplishing his goals. Cause let's remember, Urahara still wasn't allowed to step into Soul Society. On the other hand, Aizen continued doing experiments to understand why Urahara's Hogyoku was functional while his own wasn't, and also he was trying to localize the visors, probably to study them to make his own Hogyoku functional. One of those experiments consisted of creating a hollow using as base a perished Shinigami soul and the sum of those. The objective was to replicate the Asauchi effect of penetrating into a Shinigami soul, and then trying if a hollow made out of Shinigami souls could completely fuse with another Shinigami soul without provoking soul suicide. However, as we know, the experiment turned out to be another one, cause White, instead of parasitizing Isshin, a Shinigami soul, ends up parasitizing Masaki's Quincy soul, resulting in Isshin becoming a being somewhere between a human and a Shinigami to keep in check Masaki's hollowification. Years later, Ichigo Kurosaki was born, and he inherited all of his parents' powers, resulting in a being whose soul possessed all types of existent souls, and therefore also possessed the antagonic types to all types of souls within him, meaning Ichigo's soul is perfectly balanced even though it's formed out of distinct types of souls, thus explaining why Ichigo can evade soul suicide and can live a normal life. That means Aizen Urahara created a soul who transcends any existent soul potential, cause his maximum potential is determined by the sum of all the maximum potentials of each type of soul he possesses and his own latent or base potential as an individual, thus creating a being even capable of replacing the Soul King, cause the Reiō also was created by the sum of distinct types of souls. But of course, the Reiō's latent potential is superior to Ichigo's one, cause the Reiō was created by the sum of a major amount of souls due to being the universe itself who created him to evade coming to an end at all cost. That's why Aizen is so curious about Ichigo, cause he's a partial creation of his own and has the potential to become a transcendental being capable of overthrowing the Soul King's false reign, just what Aizen wants to achieve by breaking his limits as a Shinigami soul. Here ends the first half of this guide about Hogyoku. There's still a lot of interesting things to talk about if we take as base all the things we have seen throughout this video. The second half will be on screen as soon as it's uploaded to the channel, and it will last around the same running time as this one. And of course, it should take me less time to produce it than this first half, cause I've already scripted almost the entirety of it. Finally, thank you for watching. Give a thumbs up and subscribe if you like this content, and don't forget to press the bell to receive a notification every time I upload new Bleach content. I remind you to go over my Twitter or Instagram if you wanna be informed about the latest updates about my videos, and I will see you soon. Bye!